OPB Podcasts.
It's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, June 11th. Decades before the Me Too movement ushered in an era where high-profile men were held accountable for sexual assault, there was Bob Packwood. He was a moderate Republican U.S. Senator who spent nearly 27 years representing Oregon and Washington, D.C. Some people considered him a champion of women's rights, but if so, his feminism was certainly selective. He also wrote detailed diary entries that included disturbing predatory behavior toward female staffers. Packwood resigned in what is still considered one of the more stunning sex scandals in congressional history. Packwood died last week. He was 93. We're going to talk about Packwood's legacy and his influence on Oregon. And to do so, today on the podcast, we have a very special guest who will sound familiar to our longtime listeners. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
And I'm Jeff Mapes. I used to be OPB's senior political reporter. Well, that was before I retired a few years ago.
Jeff, welcome back. It is so fun to have you on the podcast and truly feels like old times, a great era.
Back in the saddle. Jeff's back in the Gert Boyle.
Back in the saddle.
Feels good.
Good. Okay, Jeff, you were actually at the Oregonian covering politics during the Bob Packwood scandal. And they flew you out to D.C. just before the ethics report was released. Is that right? And just tell us what that was like.
Yeah, that is indeed the case. It was a very dramatic moment, I got to tell you. You have to remember, this was in the fall of 1995, and for almost 3 years, we had been covering this sex scandal, involving Packwood, and it just went on and on. There were dramatic encounters in the state, picketers against Packwood, supporters lining up. I mean, he went on the air to defend himself. He just fought like hell to keep his seat. And now here we're at this moment where the Ethics Committee was recommending his ouster. And on the plane out, we knew the report was going to be released the next day. I was on a night flight, and we knew it was going to be a blockbuster. They'd been investigating this for a long time.
Yeah, behind closed doors, right? They had been investigating it, so...
Right. And, there had been, at one point, it looked like Packwood was going to resign. I remember a Portland TV station reported that. I was under all this pressure to match it, and... after calling my sources, I said it's not going to happen, and it didn't. Wow. Not then. So it was quite a ride.
So cool you were there. Okay, but before we get really deep into his congressional career and the end of his congressional career, let's just remind our audience a bit about more who this person was, and let's just start at the very beginning, his upbringing.
Yeah, well, that was pretty interesting, too. His father was a well-known lobbyist at the Oregon legislature. So young Bob Packwood, he just grew up around politics. He had legislators, I think even maybe a governor or senator or two at his dinner table, kind of the elite of the state policymakers, business community and everything. At the same time, there was this really dark side. His father was also a raging alcoholic, wound up in the local jail more than once. There were some pretty lurid stories about him, too. Packwood himself was a bright student, but a nerdy kid. He had these big, thick glasses because of a vision problem, and he actually wanted to be an engineer at one point. But instead, in the early 1950s, he wound up at Willamette University, right across the street from the state capitol. So you could say going back to his roots in one case. And he actually ended up being mentored by Mark Hatfield, who was a professor at the school and was beginning his own, really fast rise in Oregon politics. In fact, by the end of the 1950s, Hatfield was governor. He was like 36 or 37 at the time. And Packwood very quickly followed by winning his own seat in the Oregon House. And he was practicing the same brand of politics in the sense of very moderate, almost liberal by today's standards. And it was in vogue with many of the young Republicans, like who'd come back from World War II and stuff. And the thing that really distinguished him was that he had a real affinity for the campaign side of politics. I mean, he was put in charge of this big organizing effort to elect Republican legislators. And yeah, I have to say, in all my years of covering politics, I don't think I've met anybody who is more obsessed with shaping the political battlefield than he was. I mean, he was constantly fundraising. He cajoled and threatened rivals to keep them from running against him. I mean, he was very clever about all this stuff.
Well, speaking of the campaign, one thing that stood out in the obituary that you wrote about him to me was that he was an early adopter of tapping a lot of women to get involved into his campaign, which apparently at the time was sort of unusual. And I thought that was noteworthy because clearly at some point in his life, he thought that women, were more than just an object for him to do with whatever he wants to do, which we will get to. But talk to me about, why some women's groups really felt like he was an ally.
Yeah, well, from the start, he recognized they were an underutilized campaign resource. I mean, early on, he had them helping him make big strategic decisions, really running the campaign. There were a lot of very bright women who were, like many men, going to college, but then staying home to raise children. And he really put them to work. And at the same time, he really became a big champion of opening up the workplace to them. And most remarkable of all, he became the primary champion of abortion rights in Congress. I mean, you can't imagine a Republican being in that position. But in that, I mean, he knew and became close to so many champions of the abortion rights movement, so many feminists. Gloria Steinem was a friend of his, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah, that's really surprising. And also a timeline here. This is before Roe v. Wade that he was out there championing this reproductive health care.
Right. I think he introduced the first bill in Congress to totally legalize abortion, once again before Roe versus Wade.
That was 1970. And we should know, I think we left off in his timeline when he was in the legislature. In 68, he runs a campaign, very young person, running a campaign against longtime U.S. Senator Wayne Morse, challenging him a bunch of stuff. I mean, Wayne Morse was a little long in the tooth, kind of rambly. I think Packwood was very tight with his talking points and his attacks, but also really challenged Morse on the Vietnam War. Packwood was, happy to identify as a hawk. Morse was more dovish. So he wins election to the U.S. Senate, I think at 36, being the youngest person in the Senate or even Congress at that time. One of the two. He was very, very young.
Well, in fact, when Joe Biden was elected a few years later, he displaced Packwood as the youngest senator.
Gotcha.
So it's sort of a funny thing there.
Well, he also sort of early on carved out this reputation for being a bit of a maverick.
Yep.
He was the first Senate Republican to support the impeachment of President Nixon, for example. He often worked with environmental groups. We talked about his reproductive rights stance.
Yeah, I mean, the environmental piece, I think, was interesting. It was certainly a part of his early time in office, maybe not toward the end, but he was well known for going to bat for a number of things in terms of preservation. I think a big one was this long debate over whether there should be more dams on the Snake River in this place called Hell's Canyon. Preservationists had been fighting for years to sort of wall off this piece of Hell's Canyon so that there could be no more hydroelectric dams. Packwood wound up in 75 being one of the people to muscle across this protection bill. But, the way he explained it, he was kind of late to that debate. Here is what he told OPB in 2013 about how he became part of the Hell's Canyon push.
I was not their first choice. But they went to Senator Hatfield, and they went to Senator Magnuson and Senator Jackson in Washington. They went every place. They went to the House. They couldn't find anybody to sponsor a bill, so they came to me. And I had seen what the East had done to some of its waterways when I was in the law school. So I kind of had an inclination to want to save things.
Packwood went to law school in New York. He says, he saw what people could do to waterways when they're overbuilding on them, and he became this person that was interested in preservation. He also had a role in helping protect the Columbia River Gorge, though I think, and Jeff knows more about this than me, but I think Senator Hatfield probably had a larger role there. But Jeff, you also noted when we were talking that, Packwood had this environmental reputation. he was willing to trade it away for things he thought were more important when the timber wars began and the spotted owl stuff happened.
Very quickly, and it surprised a lot of people after the spotted owl decision came out to protect the spotted owl. He jumped right into the fray, saying, "I'm full force for the timber industry. I'm going to go out and lead demonstrations against this and protect our jobs in the timber industry." One thing you have to understand about Packwood, this was a guy who loved to be in the political middle. I mean, he bragged about being like 50% in ratings from groups across the spectrum: labor, business, environment, et cetera, and with, once again, a few exceptions. And he saw it as sort of part of his legislative prowess, that he could be in the middle of so many fights, and also as a great campaign tactic. That's one way that he pushed a lot of people out, because he had friends across the aisle.
Right.
And so that made a big difference.
Something else that he received a lot of attention for was his input on tax policy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was kind of an amazing tale in itself. Packwood was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which was in charge of the tax code, and was frankly considered, he was a wheeler dealer. He loved to sneak in little tax breaks to things. And there was a lot of pressure to do tax reform then. And so he started out doing his own plan, and he just couldn't resist putting more and more tax breaks in there. And the whole thing, it kind of collapsed of its own weight. And so he and his tax aide, classic, they repaired to a tavern on Capitol Hill, drank 2 pitchers of beer, and decided, we're going to out-reform the reformers. And they came up with a plan that just stripped all sorts of tax deductions away, really dramatically lowered rates, and came up with a bill that passed, that Reagan signed. This was right before his 86 re-election, so that was helpful in that regard. Although I have to say, it turned out not to be super politically popular. That's a discussion for a whole nother day, I think.
But it is, I think, known as like the biggest sort of overhaul of the tax code maybe in congressional history.
I think that's fair to say, certainly in the sense of not just raising or lowering rates,
right,
but really trying to deal with a lot of the complexities of the tax code. It was a different time. One of the odd things about it is that in reconnecting to the tax code, Oregon could get the same amount of revenue by lowering its state income tax rates. And Packwood had actually urged the state, don't lower your rates, just save that extra money for education.
But, as I read it, this is also this moment in time where Packwood, as the chair of the Finance Committee, he's a very, very influential, pretty well-known senator, to the point that people are talking about him potentially running for president. Actually, when we were looking into OPB archives, we found an interview, I believe from '84, that he did with an old OPB television talk show. And he was asked about this. Here's part of that exchange.
Is Bob Packwood running for office? It has been said that you are running for the presidency.
I'm running for re-election in '86, and barring unforeseen circumstances, that's going to be the last race. I think I'll run once more and retire, but I have no plans for running for the presidency.
And, there were unforeseen circumstances aplenty. One of them, he did run in '86 and won again, and he ran again in 1992.
All right, so I think we covered what perhaps his legacy would have been, but is most definitely not. And just as a warning to our audience, now we are going to get into the much darker parts of Packwood's life, which includes sexually assaulting scores of women. Dirk, this was something that it turns out was sort of known to people in Packwood's circle, but it really only became known to the public in 1992 when the Washington Post published an investigation.
Yeah, that's right. In 92, the Post began investigating a story that I believe a freelance reporter brought to them who had been doing some digging on sexual misconduct on Capitol Hill and came across Packwood. And this story really reported that Packwood had been very inappropriate with female staff over the course of decades. That story actually dropped, notably, right after Packwood had won re-election in '92, because it turns out he had successfully pushed back publication with a variety of tactics. He had been sort of, calling people's reputations into question, all sorts of things. But the story was, I have to say, very damning. It reported on accounts from both former female staffers of Packwood and also, I think, one activist in Eugene. I read over it yesterday, but I may be misremembering. But they all had remarkably similar stories over the course of decades about Packwood getting them alone and then really essentially pouncing on them. He would get them in an office, for instance, close the door, immediately start kissing them, forcing his tongue into their mouth, trying to remove their clothes, pinning them to the wall in some cases. And it's just this very consistent pattern that the Post reported that was corroborated by people who were told about it at the time. I mean, it presented this unmistakable pattern, and it was really the beginning of the end of Packwood's time in power in the Senate.
Jeff, what was the reaction to this in Oregon in the 1990s? I mean, did Oregonians quickly get angry and sort of turn on him? Did people stand by him? What do you remember from that time?
People were furious at first. And you got to remember, a big part of it was these revelations came out literally just a couple weeks after the election. I remember my Thanksgiving being very interrupted by this. So it was really not long at all. And so, for example, Democrats, Les Coyne, the Democrat who ran against Packwood, they were just livid that nobody had reported this story before, that he got away with this. And so I have to say, a lot of the anger came down on the Oregonian as well as the largest newspaper in the state, and I think rightfully so. I mean, I had something of a role in it, and I have to say, at the paper, we failed to adequately investigate that story. We did, but didn't get close to being able to land it. And so that there was a lot of anger about that. There was a lot of anger at Packwood, and a big part of this is all, as Dirk had said, there were all these rumors that Packwood was a skirt chaser, womanizer, kind of pick your term. But it was an era where people kind of didn't really look carefully into what was behind that terminology, and that's been a big story of the whole Me Too movement, and a lot of what we've seen over the last several years.
Yeah, I think now there's more of a collective understanding, a language to use about that maybe empowers women to come forward and feel like they're going to be believed, where I would imagine during that era, a lot of those women probably didn't want to go to reporters at the Oregonian and go on the record and say this is happening.
Yeah, it was very uncharted territory, not only in that, but also in how politicians would respond, because there wasn't such a big playbook, so to speak. One thing that was interesting, after the story broke, Packwood did go to an alcoholic treatment center, and when he came out, he did apologize, and that was exactly what some of his top advisors were urging him to do: just apologize, and kind of save your seat in the Senate. You're going to take a lot of heat, but you can protect your seat. But as the investigations began to mount, it was clear, that the ethics committee was going to look at him. Packwood pretty quickly became very combative. He started gathering affidavits, to cast doubt on, what his accusers were saying, saying they weren't telling the truth. I mean, the whole thing, to many of his advisors, seemed kind of bonkers. I mean, you could question one or two stories, he said, she said, but after 20 or 30, I remember at one time at the Oregonian, one of the reporters who was working full-time and sort of collecting stories from women said, at a certain point, where do we stop counting? And they just were so bizarre, as you talk about, this just sort of sudden thing looming out, all of a sudden pressing yourself against an elevator operator in the Capitol. Or one time, the one that sticks in my mind is a clerk behind a hotel counter in Portland. Just strange.
Yeah, we could go into some of these things that this uncovered. One of the ones that really sticks out to me is a mail clerk that worked for Packwood. She was in the original Washington Post story, Paige Wagers. And when she was 21 and working for Packwood at the Senate, she describes him calling her into his office, immediately closing the door and sort of pouncing her in this way, kissing her, forcing his tongue down her throat, being visibly upset, shaking and crying after that, and leaving Packwood's office not long after, only to get another job on Capitol Hill. And she describes 5 years later feeling really good about herself, where she is professionally. She's got a job in another department, running into Packwood in the basement of the Senate office building or the Capitol or one of these places on the Hill, and sort of falling in to step alongside him because it was crowded. Eventually gets to talk to Packwood about what she's doing, and he seems genuinely interested. And she begins to think to herself, okay, wow, like he's taking me seriously as a person. I feel very good. This is very validating about where I've come. He ends up saying, well, come to my office with me, popping her into this abandoned office, immediately closing the door, pouncing her in the exact same way. She's married by that. Just really, really gobsmacking, frankly, behavior to read about a senator doing. And again, this is just one person. This investigation, we should probably get to some of the machinations of the investigation, but this investigation, I believe, turned up 18 either acts of misconduct or victims. I can't recall, but
these were the ones they could corroborate,
correct.
Really. And, I think they had the same sort of thing. Let's stick with the ones that we can make the strongest case on. I mean, we don't need 36 or, 72 or whatever.
Right.
At a certain point, yeah.
Okay, so was there more in the Senate ethics investigation that came out? Or tell us about the investigation.
Well, I think what's interesting, and Jeff, his diaries, you mentioned them, come into play in this investigation in a really key way. And Jeff, can you help us understand?
Yeah. And that was the big revelation during the ethics committee investigation, was that he had been keeping this diary that, was about a lot of things, but it had extensive details about he would call them sexual exploits. It's like he's portraying himself as this character out of an Ian Fleming, James Bond book or something. But once this became known, Packwood realized what poison it was to him. And, the guy went all the way to the Supreme Court in an attempt to keep the Ethics Committee from getting that diary. That failed. And in fact, the panel eventually came to believe that Packwood was actively, trying to obstruct their inquiry. And that became a major part of why they were recommending that he be expelled from the Senate was in the end.
Yeah, it turned out he had an aide that would dictate his stuff into a tape, and then he'd have one of his aides type it up. And he was eventually having her transcribe things that weren't on the tape to make it sound better, and doctoring the tape itself. That became a big part of it. We should get a piece of how Packwood explained all this. So in 2013, when OPB was talking to him about his career and what happened, obviously we asked about all the misconduct. Here's part of the way he explained this.
So there's no question drinking was involved. That is not an excuse. It's an explanation, but it's not an excuse. And that wasn't true in all cases. But as I say, in the majority of the cases, I could not remember the woman, could not remember the incident. In some cases, it was one time, one night. And all of the charges, save one, were over 10 years old. In two cases, 20 years old, and I just couldn't remember.
And Jeff, you noted in the obituary you ran in the Oregonian, he puts a lot of weight on drinking here, but some of this stuff, these allegations were in the morning when he typically wasn't drinking. And I do have to say, I listened to a big piece of that interview with Packwood, and his memory was very, very sharp in some places. And so this whole, I just can't remember any of this feels questionable to me.
Yeah, it was a big part of his defense. This thing is, this is all really old stuff, and everybody's memories are decayed and that sort of thing. And it may well have been that things had changed a little bit for him, and he had cleaned up some of his behavior some. But, it was not an explanation that flew once the Ethics Committee got into that. And bear in mind, this Ethics Committee investigation was, it's a panel that's evenly split between the Republicans and the Democrats. And in the end, when they, recommended an expulsion, Mitch McConnell was the chairman of the committee then. Of course, he later became Senate Majority Leader, and there's nobody more partisan. I mean, there was some sense that for a while, McConnell tried to hang up the deliberations of the panel. So maybe he did a few things to help Packwood. But at a certain point, he also concluded this guy needs to go.
Okay, so the Ethics Committee ultimately determines there's credible evidence that Packwood has assaulted at least 18 people, but sexual misconduct was really only a part of the findings against Packwood. We mentioned him trying to obstruct the investigation, but there were also findings that he worked to get income for his wife before they divorced so that he could sort of pay less in child support or alimony.
So this is, as I understand it, and Jeff, correct me if you think this is wrong, this is actually one of the things that ultimately helped doom Packwood, because as I understand things, his attorneys were submitting portions of his diaries to these congressional investigators, just little snippets. And there was a mention in there in one of those entries that Packwood had been essentially gaming the divorce court. Like, he was preparing to separate and divorce his wife. And in the course of that was going to friends he had within the lobby and saying, well, could you find a way to give Georgie, his wife at the time, some income for this or that? If you do that, then I will have to pay less in alimony. That became a thing that really perked investigators' ears up and said, wait, this is in his diaries. What else is in his diaries? Let's go looking for that. And that became this court fight that Jeff mentioned, where he was fighting that, and then all this spills out into the public.
No, I think you got that about right. And there was just so much in those diaries about everything. I mean, it's kind of like the Epstein papers a little bit.
Yeah, and we talk about, in our obit, some people have reported this thing about, if she didn't want me to feather her nest, she shouldn't have come into the Xerox room. I don't know the context behind that. I haven't been able to find it, but there was some, you mentioned up top, Lauren, very shocking things in there.
So Packwood resigns, and ultimately that was a very emotional moment for him.
Yeah, I happened to be in the Senate press gallery at the time looking down. And in fact, we didn't know this was going to happen in advance. And Packwood walks out and into the Senate floor, I should say, rather. And, he's called on and gets up and announces that he's resigning his chairmanship of the Senate Finance Committee and is going to leave the Senate in a couple weeks. And, the funny thing to me, and then he sits back down. Mark Hatfield is next to him, sort of providing some emotional support for him. And Packwood sat there for the longest time listening to his peers on the Senate floor, now that the big fight was over, stand up and say, oh, gosh, you were a great asset to this institution. We really appreciate your memory, telling a few old war stories. And it was like he just wanted to soak up every last minute of what he knew was, coming to an end. And it makes me think, I remember years later talking to Packwood, and he said he would have traded all of his post-Senate financial success just to stay in office.
You mentioned, though, McConnell eventually, deciding it was hopeless. I think Bob Dole had a role at the time in sort of defending him and then deciding it was hopeless. He was very clear-eyed about how the politics of this worked. Here's what he told OPB in that same 2013 interview about the sort of stink surrounding him as all this transpired.
You discover this in politics, and there is a rule, and all games have rules. When you become poison, the group leaves you. But I understood that when I went into politics, and it really wouldn't matter if it's women or allegations of corruption. Even if the corruption is not proven, you are tainted.
I think my sense of Packwood is of a fairly Machiavellian figure, a consummate politician, very, he calls it a game there. And so he could see this for what, kind of coolly, it feels like, dispassionately, even though I'm sure it was very painful for him to have to do that.
No, I think that's exactly right.
Talk about a different political era, though. I mean, yes, he became poisoned. He had to resign, and yet when he does so, they stand and commemorate him and speak fondly of him. Like, that would not happen today. But,
hard to imagine.
So Packwood becomes a lobbyist later in life. What do we know about his final years?
Yeah, so he he says that he had to take about a year off. You can't, there's a revolving door rule, so you at least can't begin to represent folks that have interest before the committee that you were chairing. But pretty soon, Packwood finds, he told OPB, that, the taint on him for some of his sexual misconduct doesn't go that far, because he is this person that can get in with senators, that understands the issues, and that understands how to sell issues to senators. So he eventually becomes a pretty well-paid lobbyist for a number of concerns, just because people find that the skill and the relationships he has amassed in his time in the Senate are just invaluable. And I think, I believe he made a very comfortable living after the Senate.
He did quite well, yes. He had a very nice house in Dunthorpe, on the Willamette River, or just above it. One thing that struck me about that period is that Packwood, I remember, told me that he often didn't actually want to go talk to his former colleagues so much as he liked to talk to Senate aides, because Packwood is a guy who could go as deep into the policy weeds as you want to go. And he found that was much of his influence, that aides, is like, wow, I get to spend an hour or two with this guy? This is pretty cool, some 25-year-old aide or something. And that was, at least according to Packwood, and it makes sense to me, that was part of his lobbying success.
And, in his personal life, an interesting postscript, Packwood winds up marrying Elaine Franklin, who was his chief of staff when all this sort of took root. I mean, I think she's in that original Washington Post story calling it a witch hunt. Ends up marrying her. She's a political operative in her own right. They lived in Oregon for a long time. He eventually died while they were staying at a vacation home in Southern California at 93.
Clearly, a big part of his legacy is just his misconduct with women. But, Jeff, do you think he leaves any other political legacy behind?
That's a hard question. I was thinking about this. Unlike Hatfield, whose name is on buildings all over the state, I can't think of any public monument honoring Packwood. And, of course, part of it was he wasn't on the Appropriations Committee like Hatfield, where, you get to dole out money for pride, to build things. But, he was the Commerce Chair and the Finance Chair. I suspect things would have been different if not for, what had happened to him there. But still, to this day, if you're digging into a lot of policy issues, we talked about Hell's Canyon, but I could bring up more. He was very involved in trucking deregulation. The tax stuff, healthcare. I mean, you'd find his fingerprints on that. And he had a large network of, former aides who've gone on to do all sorts of stuff. Some of them are still involved in politics to this day.
It's funny you mentioned the Hatfield thing. We OPB asked him about that in that 2013 interview. He said, that's how it works. I was on the finance committee. You don't get stuff named after you when you're the committee that takes money from people. You get stuff named after you when you're in the committee that gives money and is financing stuff. That said, not beyond the realm to imagine that we might be seeing Bob Packwood Bridge or whatever had he left Congress a little more cleanly.
Yeah. And one thing that is funny that Packwood always sort of chafed a little bit of that Hatfield got so much praise for all the pork, frankly, he brought back to Oregon. And one thing that Packwood, I remember one time talking to him for an advance obituary I did on Hatfield, and he came to me with a big binder full of his own legislative accomplishments and said, Mark Hatfield, wonderful gentleman, but he was not the legislator that I was.
The only other thing I would say is Packwood was the founder of the Dorchester Conference, which is the annual GOP get-together in its 60th year now, I believe. So, talk about a legacy. I mean, that is one very easily viewable place that Packwood had an impact. I don't think it's this, when he founded it, it was far right-wingers stay away. We're moderate Democrats, or we're moderate Republicans here, and that's who's talking. And I wouldn't say that's the case at Dorchester these days.
Slightly different energy now.
But the event remains.
Okay, Jeff, final question, because we have you, another hard one. We have spent a lot of this podcast talking about an era where, like we said, moderate Republicans reigned. Tom McCall, Mark Hatfield, Packwood, all very influential. I'm curious, what you think about the current landscape of the GOP. They have had a very hard time in this state for decades now to win statewide elected office. What happened? Have the politicians changed? Have the electorate changed? Everybody's changed? What's your take? Hot take.
I guess if there is one, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, for years, and me included, but pundits in Oregon have always said, oh, the Republicans went too far to the right. They booted out all their moderates. And there might have been something to this. But this happened nationally. I mean, there are not people like Mark Hatfield and Bob Packwood in the Senate. You could maybe say one or two that start to verge there, but they more stick with their party. And now politics seems to be to the point where you hew much more closely to your base, and that's what gets you elected and reelected. I don't think many interest groups would put up today with somebody who was 50% for them in voting. So
yeah, the political polarization has
Right.
just gotten so extreme.
I can't imagine somebody bragging that they were politically moderate today, in the way that Jeff was describing Packwood doing.
And maybe it has, you mentioned the electorate, Lauren. I mean, I haven't looked at how we were electing people back then, but I think it was far more 50-50. We elected some Dems, some Republicans. Oregon is a far more blue state today, obviously, and that's what we've seen drift around the country. It's easier to be the guy that says, I got 50% from every interest group if you're in a purple state that's truly a toss-up. But, with our primary system, too, it often forces people to be
And I do think Oregon demographically has changed, and I think we've attracted a certain kind of person increasingly that tends to vote Democratic. That's a whole nother podcast.
Come back again, Jeff.
See how I set that up?
Yes, I love it because it is truly so fun having you back in the studio. Just does feel like old times, and I know the three of us could keep talking forever, but we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming in
Jeff.
today.
My pleasure.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. A special shout out to a couple of OPB colleagues this week. Christian Foden-Wenzel extensively interviewed Packwood years ago, and our archivist, Mia Firm, who tracked down a 1984 interview with a senator. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.